Martha Heller took off her boots at the door because the cabin floor was warm. Not warm the way a floor feels warm when a fire has been burning for hours and the heat has finally seeped down through the boards. Warm the way a hearthstone is warm when it has been absorbing a fire's energy for days and has become a thing that holds heat rather than merely reflecting it. Martha stood in her wool stockings on Eleanor Marsh's stone floor and felt the warmth coming up through the soles of her feet and looked around the room for the stove. There was no stove. There was a fireplace on the north wall, small and cold, its stones dark with old ash. There was a cook fire through the back door, an outdoor arrangement of flat rocks, and an iron pot on a tripod, the kind of cooking setup a person used when they were camping, not when they had spent a full winter in a permanent structure. There was a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping platform built against the east wall, a shelf of clay jars and rolled cloth, a window of oiled paper letting in grey February light. There was no stove. Martha stood on the warm floor and looked at Eleanor Marsh and tried to form a sentence that captured the confusion she was feeling without sounding like she had lost her mind. "How?" she said. Eleanor Marsh poured hot water from the kettle she had taken off the outdoor cook fire and set a cup in front of Martha's place at the table. She was 40 years old, brown-haired and deliberate in her movements, with the particular unhurriedness of a person who had spent a long time alone and had stopped performing competence for anyone's benefit. "Sit down," she said. "I'll show you." Martha Heller was the first person Eleanor Marsh had told. She was also the first person who might actually understand, because Martha Heller had a practical mind behind her conventional opinions, and because she had walked 4 miles through February cold to check on the widow woman who everyone in the Blackwater Creek settlement agreed was living under conditions that couldn't possibly sustain a human being through a Missouri Territory winter. They were wrong about that. But they were wrong for interesting reasons, and it would take another 3 weeks and the coldest night of the year for anyone besides Martha to believe it. This is how a widow woman named Eleanor Marsh, with no stove, no cordwood supply, and a floor made of living rock, kept herself warmer than every family in the Blackwater Creek settlement through the winter of 1857 to 1858. And changed the way they thought about what a fire was actually for. Joseph Marsh had chosen the claim for the stone. This was not romantic or philosophical on his part. He was a practical man from western Pennsylvania who had grown up watching his father build with limestone and had decided that wood frame construction on the Missouri frontier was a temporary solution for people who intended to leave. Joseph intended to stay. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, and so, in the spring of 1855, he walked every acre of their claim until he found what he was looking for. The eastern face of the low ridge that ran north to south across the back quarter of the claim was limestone and sandstone, layered in the way of sedimentary rock, exposed by centuries of creek erosion eating at the base of the ridge. The stone came out in flat, stackable pieces with natural cleavage lines that made quarrying it a matter of wedges and patience rather than blasting powder. Joseph Marsh spent the entire first summer quarrying and hauling and laying the foundation and walls of the cabin, while Eleanor planted and cultivated and managed everything else a frontier homestead required. He built the cabin into the ridge itself, using the exposed rock face as the north wall of the structure. This was not unusual on the frontier. Building into a hillside reduced exposed wall surface, which reduced heat loss, which reduced the wood burning required, which reduced the labor of keeping a family alive through winter. The men who laughed at such construction because it looked like living in a cave were the men who burned 4 cords of firewood every January, wondering why they were always cold. The cabin Joseph built was 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, its north wall the limestone face of the ridge, its other 3 walls double-coursed stone laid in clay mortar. The floor was the bedrock shelf that the ridge presented at ground level, a flat expanse of sandstone broken by a single crack running roughly east to west through the middle of the floor space. Joseph had cursed the crack repeatedly during construction. It was 6 inches wide in some places, narrowing to 2 inches at the eastern end, where it disappeared into the wall. He had tried to fill it with clay mortar and flat stone chips, and it had resisted filling, the crack running deeper than it appeared, and the mortar crumbling out within weeks from moisture and the slight movement that stone does over the course of seasons. He built around it. He put the table so that the crack ran beneath it, rather than across the walking paths. He told Eleanor the floor was imperfect, but stone was still better than dirt. He died in the second summer, a diamondback rattlesnake on a warm August afternoon near the creek where he was laying stone for a smokehouse. He was 41 years old, and in the good health of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, and he was dead within 6 hours of the bite, and Eleanor buried him herself because the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and by the time she reached them and came back with help, there was nothing left to do but dig. She stayed on the claim. This was not a simple decision, and she did not make it simply. She sat in the stone cabin for a week after the burial and inventoried everything she had and everything she did not have, and calculated whether survival was possible, and arrived at an answer that was not yes and not no, but was something closer to probably, which on the frontier was generally the best answer available. She had the cabin, solid and tight. She had Joseph's quarrying tools, the wedges and the sledge, and the long iron pry bar. She had 40 acres of ground broken and half of it in corn. She had a milk cow, 2 pigs, a flock of chickens. She had her own knowledge, which included teaching school for 8 years in Pennsylvania and reading everything she could find in 2 languages and helping her father run his grain mill from the time she was 10, which meant she understood mechanical principles and the relationship between force and structure and flow in ways that most people did not. She had the stone cabin with its imperfect floor and its crack that would not fill. She had the winter coming. The first winter she survived on firewood and the cast-iron stove Joseph had hauled from St. Louis at considerable expense on the wagon that had brought them west. The stove sat in the center of the main room, its pipe running up through the roof, its belly consuming wood at a rate that alarmed her as September became October, and October became the weeks when the temperature began to drop toward the numbers that killed livestock and frosted wells. She burned through her winter supply by February, and spent the last 6 weeks of the cold season burning green wood she cut herself from the creek-bottom timber. Wet wood that smoked and hissed and gave inadequate heat and left creosote layering up her pipe in deposits that she cleared with a long brush every week, because she had seen what happened to a chimney fire in a structure that was all stone and had no good way to evacuate the family. She made it to spring, but she made it the way you make it when you are surviving rather than living, tight and anxious and always aware of the arithmetic of fuel against cold. That spring she paid attention to the floor. She had been living with the crack for 2 years at that point, stepping around it, putting the table over the widest part, ignoring it the way you ignore an imperfection in a house you did not build yourself. But in April of 1856, when the last of the winter cold had finally released its grip on the Missouri hills, and the days were warming and the nights still had an edge, she knelt beside the crack and put her hand over it, and felt something she had not expected. Warmth. A steady, consistent warmth, rising out of the crack like the breath of something living below the floor. She pressed her palm flat against the stone beside the crack, and then flat against the stone farther away, and measured the difference. The stone immediately beside the crack was warmer, noticeably warmer, by several degrees at least. The stone farther away was cool, the ordinary temperature of rock on a spring day, but alongside the crack, something was different. She got down on her stomach and put her face close to the crack and breathed in. The air coming up from below was warmer than the cabin air. Not dramatically, not like a fire's heat, but measurably, consistently warmer. And it smelled of rock and deep earth, the mineral smell of places where the sun had never reached. She went to find her father's books. Eleanor Marsh had carried 17 books from Pennsylvania to Missouri Territory in a wooden crate that she had refused to leave behind, despite Joseph's pointed observations about weight and wagon space. Among them was a book her father had bought from a traveling bookseller in Philadelphia in 1839, a translated volume of notes from a French engineer who had spent time studying the ancient Roman sites in southern France and England. The engineer had been particularly interested in a Roman heating system called the hypocaust, from the Greek words meaning heat and below, a system in which a fire was built in a furnace room outside the main living space, and the hot gases and warmth were channeled through a raised floor or through channels in the floor, radiating heat upward through the stone and warming the rooms above without any open fire in the living space. Eleanor had read this book 3 years before and found it interesting in the way she found most things interesting, as information about the world. She had not thought about it since. Now, kneeling on the warm sandstone beside the crack in her floor, she thought about it with the concentrated attention of a woman who had spent a winter burning wet wood and was not willing to do it again. She spent 2 weeks reading the book again and looking at the crack and thinking. The crack ran east to west, narrowing at the eastern end, widening at the western end where it emerged from the base of the north wall, which was also the face of the limestone ridge. This meant the crack connected to the rock system of the ridge itself, the deep thermal mass of the hill, which sat at the consistent ground temperature of 53 to 55 degrees, regardless of season. The warmth she felt was not geothermal in any dramatic sense. It was not a hot spring or a volcanic feature. It was simply the Earth's thermal mass bleeding upward through the crack, the same 53 degrees that the ground gave to root cellars and dugouts and wells, finding its way up through the natural fissure in the sandstone floor into the cabin air. 53 degrees was not warm enough to live in comfortably, but 53 degrees was a foundation, and a foundation was something to build on. Eleanor Marsh looked at the crack and at the ridge behind the cabin, and at the French engineer's drawings of Roman hypocaust channels, and thought for a long time about what it would mean to use the rock itself as a stove. She began in May, after the corn was planted and she had time. She began with the crack. The natural fissure was her starting point. She widened it carefully, using Joseph's smallest chisel and a hammer, working along the line of existing weakness in the sandstone, following the cleavage of the rock rather than fighting it. This was skill she had watched her father apply to the grain mill's stonework, the understanding that stone has a grain and a direction, and that a good stonemason works with these, rather than imposing a different shape by force. She widened the crack from 6 inches to 8, from 8 to 10, following it westward toward the base of the north wall, where it entered the ridge. At the wall, she made a discovery. The crack did not simply end at the ridge face. It continued into the rock, deepening as it went, opening into a natural cavity in the limestone that measured perhaps 3 feet across and 4 feet high, tall enough that she could crouch inside it with the lantern. The cavity was connected to the outside on the far side of the ridge by a narrow passage that emerged on the slope above the cabin, hidden behind a shelf of overgrown limestone. The ridge was, in effect, a natural chimney waiting to be used. She sat in the cavity with the lantern and understood what she had found. The crack in her floor was one end of a natural channel through the rock. The cavity was a midpoint. The passage to the outside slope was the other end. Air could move through this system, driven by temperature differential, the same way air moved through any chimney, from the warmer interior toward the cooler exterior, creating a draft. If she introduced heat at the outside passage, that heat would move through the rock channel, through the cavity, up through the crack in her floor, and into her cabin. The rock itself would absorb the heat as the gases moved through it. The rock walls of the channel, the cavity, the fissure, would become warm, And warm rock, unlike warm air, held its heat for hours. Unlike a stove that cooled within minutes of the fire dying, warm stone stayed warm through the night. The Romans had understood this. Her father's book had described it in detail, the difference between heating air and heating mass. She spent the summer building. The work was precise and slow. She extended the natural channel using hand tools, cutting horizontal passages in the rock floor, using the chisel and the wedge, and hours of patient work that left her hands cramped and her shoulders aching. She followed the sandstone seams where they gave, cutting channels 4 inches wide and 6 inches deep, running them in a pattern she had sketched in the dirt beside the cabin over several mornings. A layout that would carry heat from the outside fire through the maximum amount of floor space before allowing it to exit through the crack. The pattern was not the Roman raised floor, which required constructing a whole elevated floor on pillars of stone or brick. She did not have the materials for that, and she did not have the time. What she built was simpler and in some ways more elegant, a series of shallow channels cut directly into the sandstone bedrock of the floor, covered with flat capstones of the same material that she split and fitted into place, like the pieces of a puzzle, leaving narrow gaps at the edges to allow warm air to seep up into the room. The channels ran in a modified serpentine pattern from the entry point at the north wall, where she built a small stone firebox into the cavity, west across the floor, south, then east, then west again, covering the maximum distance through the floor space before the gases exited through the widened crack. The total length of the channel system was approximately 42 feet, running beneath a floor that measured 16 by 20 feet. Every foot of that channel was surrounded by sandstone bedrock that would absorb and hold the heat passing through it. The firebox she built into the cavity was the critical element. It measured 18 inches wide by 14 inches deep, with a stone grate raised on supports to allow ash to fall through and air to reach the fire from below. The opening faced outward through the passage she had cleared in the ridge, so that fuel could be added from outside without entering the cabin, and so that the draft would draw from outside air, not from the cabin interior. The chimney passage above the firebox was the natural channel in the rock, leading up and out through the slope above, venting the exhaust outside and above the cabin, where it would disperse without entering the living space. She built a clay and stone door for the firebox opening, a flat piece that could be set in place to reduce the draft when a small fire was sufficient and removed to increase the draw when more heat was needed. She lined the lower firebox with flat pieces of harder limestone that would resist the direct heat of combustion better than the surrounding sandstone. She tested the system on a mild evening in late July, when the temperature was warm enough that any failure would not have serious consequences. She built a small fire of dry oak splits in the firebox, closed the door to half open, and went into the cabin. She put her palm on the capstans nearest the north wall and waited. In 20 minutes, she felt warmth. In 40 minutes, the capstans along the western run of the channel were noticeably warm to the touch. In 90 minutes, she walked the length of the room in her bare feet and felt the warmth rising through the narrow gaps at the capstone edges, not dramatically, not like a hearth fire, but steadily, evenly, from below. The cabin temperature was 68 degrees, 7 degrees above the July evening air outside. The fire in the firebox had consumed perhaps a quarter of what her cast-iron stove would have consumed for comparable heat, and all the heat was going into the rock rather than up a chimney. She sat on the warm floor and permitted herself to feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not triumph, which seemed too large, not relief, which was too passive. Something closer to the satisfaction of a problem solved, a mechanism understood, a principle demonstrated. She put the cast-iron stove in the barn. The neighbors began to notice in October, not the warmth inside the cabin, which they had not yet experienced, but the absence of smoke. Every other cabin in the Blackwater Creek settlement produced its testimony in smoke, a column rising from the chimney pipe each morning that told the world the fire was lit and the family was warm. Eleanor Marsh's cabin had no chimney pipe. When she needed more heat than the rock floor provided on its own, she lit a fire in the outside firebox, and the smoke went up through the stone passage in the ridge and emerged on the hillside behind the cabin, 40 feet from the nearest opening, dissipating in the open air without the visible column that marked a conventional household fire. From the road and from across the settlement's cleared land, the Marsh cabin looked like an occupied structure in which no fire had been lit. This was incorrect, but it looked that way, and on the frontier, looking a particular way was often taken as evidence of the underlying reality. Calvin Heller noticed first. He rode past on a Wednesday in early October, saw no smoke, thought the widow woman must be burning low or not at all, mentioned it at the Forsyth General Store that afternoon. Harlan Cross heard it and added that the woman had always seemed a little peculiar, living alone up on that ridge claim, never coming to church, barely speaking at the trading post. Bill Watts, who had the claim to Eleanor's south, said he hadn't seen her cut any wood in weeks, which seemed like a bad sign for a woman heading into her third Missouri winter alone. The concern was genuine, as frontier concern usually was, threaded through with judgment, but genuine nonetheless. People did not want Eleanor Marsh to freeze to death in her stone cabin. They also suspected she might be heading in that direction, and several of them felt a complicated mixture of sympathy and told you so about the prospect of a woman trying to manage a claim without a man. Nobody rode out to check on her. Not that week. They talked about it and monitored the smoke situation from a distance and told each other someone ought to ride out, and nobody did. Martha Heller did, eventually, because Martha Heller was the kind of woman who tired of talking about doing things and went and did them. She rode out on a Thursday in late October with a basket of dried apples and a loaf of cornbread, and the stated intention of determining whether the Marsh woman needed help, and the unstated intention of satisfying her own curiosity about what exactly was happening in that cabin with no smoke. Eleanor Marsh came to the door when she heard the horse and invited Martha inside without ceremony, the way people do when they have been expecting something, or when they do not bother anymore with the performance of surprise. Martha came through the door and took her boots off because the floor was warm. She stood in her stockings and looked for the stove and found none. She looked at the cold fireplace and the warm floor, and Eleanor Marsh standing at the table pouring hot water, and the entirety of the situation failed to assemble itself into any arrangement she recognized. "How?" she said. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I'll show you." She showed her. She took Martha through the cabin and lifted one of the capstones near the north wall to show her the channel beneath, cutting down through the bedrock at a slight angle, its walls showing the dark marks of heat passage. She took her outside and around the ridge to the firebox entry, a low opening in the rock face that Martha would not have found on her own. She opened the clay door and showed her the firebox interior, the stone grate, the residual ash of the previous evening's fire. She showed her the channel running up through the stone and out the top of the ridge 40 feet above. She described the system in the terms she understood it. Heat from the fire entered the rock and moved through the channels and warmed the stone bedrock of the floor. The stone held the heat for hours after the fire had gone out. The floor of the cabin was the stove. Martha Heller stood at the firebox opening and looked at the cleverness of it for a long time without speaking. She was not a simple woman, and she understood physical principles well enough to follow what Eleanor was describing. She just needed time for her understanding to catch up to the evidence her feet had already provided. "How long did this take?" she asked finally. "Most of the summer," Eleanor said. "The channels are the difficult part. The rock is hard. You cut these yourself." It was not a question. "Yes." Martha looked at the entrance to the outside passage. cut clean through the limestone, 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, enough for a person to kneel and tend a fire. She looked at the precise fitting of the stone door. She thought about what a summer of chiseling through bedrock would require of a person's hands, her back, her patience. She thought about what Calvin would have said if she had proposed spending the summer cutting channels in the floor of their house. She thought about what she would have said herself, probably, if she had not been standing here with warm feet in October, with no stove in sight. "Does it get warm enough?" she asked. "In the coldest months?" "Come back in January," Eleanor said. "I'll show you then." Martha came back in November and brought cornmeal and dried beef. Eleanor's floor was 70 degrees at the capstans nearest the firebox, 62 degrees at the far end of the room. The cabin air was 65. Outside it was 28. She came back in December and brought her husband Calvin, who spent 15 minutes poking at the capstan covers and frowning at the floor in a way that suggested he was revising an opinion he had not explicitly stated, but had definitely held. He asked technical questions about the draft and the firebox dimensions and the type of wood that worked best, and Eleanor answered them precisely and without impatience. Before he left, Calvin Heller had spent 20 minutes sitting on the warm floor with his back against the east wall and his legs stretched out in front of him, looking at the ceiling, not saying anything. "It works," he said finally, as if announcing the conclusion of a private court case. "Yes," Eleanor said. He nodded. He looked at the cold fireplace, the empty stove spot, the capstones laid into the floor. He calculated something in his head that Eleanor did not ask him to share. Then he rode home with his wife through the December cold and said nothing for most of the 4 miles, which was how Calvin Heller processed things that required him to revise his understanding of what was possible. Martha Heller told 5 people about the floor before Christmas. She told them accurately and in detail because she had seen it and felt it and understood the mechanism well enough to explain it, and because the story was one that demanded telling. She described the channels, the firebox outside, the capstones, the steady warmth of the floor and the walls that had absorbed the heat from weeks of use. She described the fuel consumption, which was approximately 1/3 of what a cast-iron stove required for comparable interior temperatures, because the heat went into the rock rather than up a chimney. The responses followed a predictable pattern. Interest, followed by skepticism, followed by the argument that it couldn't possibly work in January, that October and November were mild compared to what the Missouri hills could deliver in the deep, cold months, that the rock floor would stop being warm when the real cold hit, and the widow woman would be sorry she'd put her stove in the barn. Nobody said this to Eleanor directly. They said it to each other, and it got back to Martha, who told it to Eleanor with the slight exasperation of a woman who knows that evidence will eventually be sufficient, but patience is required in the meantime. Eleanor listened and said nothing. She kept her firebox supplied with dry oak and hickory, burning a small fire each evening and letting the rock mass do the rest. She spent December preparing for what the old-timers in the settlement were telling anyone who would listen was going to be a hard January. They were right. January of 1858 came into Missouri territory on the back of a polar air mass that had moved south from Canada without any of the gradual warming and cooling that normally cushioned the transition between seasons. On January 8th, the temperature at the Blackwater Creek settlement was 17 degrees Fahrenheit. On January 9th, it was 4. On January 10th, it did not rise above 0 degrees all day, and by midnight it had dropped to -18. The Heller cabin, a well-built frame structure with a good iron stove and a full cord of wood stacked against the south wall, burned through its daily wood allocation in 16 hours, trying to maintain the temperature above 50 degrees. Calvin sat up through the night feeding the stove, sleeping in intervals of 20 minutes, waking to add wood, sleeping again. By morning, he had burned 3 times his normal daily supply, and the interior temperature had still dropped to 43 degrees in the eastern bedroom, where the stove's heat didn't reach. The cross cabin 4 miles north was worse. Harlan Cross had estimated his wood supply in October and had been wrong in his estimate, the way men are sometimes wrong when they estimate things they have not actually measured. By January 10th, he was burning through his reserves faster than he had planned, and by the evening of the 10th, he was calculating whether rationing was possible and how cold 40 degrees felt to a woman and 2 children sleeping under every blanket in the house. Bill Watts, south of the Marsh claim, had built with green lumber that summer, and the walls of his new addition had gaps in them that the December freeze had revealed. He had stuffed them with rags and mud, and these had held until January, when the temperature was cold enough that the stuffing contracted and the gaps opened, and a constant cold draft cut through the north wall of the addition like a living thing. And his wife Vera stood in the kitchen and felt it on her neck, and looked at the stove burning full and hard, and understood that the stove was fighting a battle it could not win. In the Marsh cabin, the floor was 61 degrees. Eleanor had built up the firebox fire the evening of January 8th, when she felt the air change and the cold take on its particular hard-edged quality. She burned a full armload of split oak, which was more than her usual evening allocation, and let it burn down to coals before closing the clay door to hold the remaining warmth in the channel system. She went to bed with the cabin at 67 degrees. She woke at 4 in the morning on the 9th and checked the temperature by feel, the way she had learned to do over 18 months of living with the system. The floor near the north wall, closest to the firebox, was 58 degrees. The air temperature in the cabin was 54. Outside, she could hear the particular silence that very cold nights had, a silence that was not the absence of sound, but was itself a sound, the sound of cold so severe that every living thing had contracted against it and gone still. She built another fire. This one she kept going for 2 hours, feeding it steadily with oak splits, before letting it burn down and closing the clay door. She went back to bed. When she rose in the morning, the floor was 60 degrees. The cabin was 64. Outside it was -11. She kept this schedule through the 3 worst days of the cold snap: morning fire, evening fire, the clay door managing the draft between them. Her wood consumption for those 3 days was 1 full armload of split oak per fire, 2 fires per day, 6 armloads total. In his stove, Calvin Heller burned 6 armloads of wood trying to heat a single room. Martha came on the afternoon of January 11th, riding through cold that she said later felt like a physical obstacle rather than merely a temperature. She came because Calvin had sent her, which was his way of doing something while appearing to do nothing. He had told her to check on the widow woman, which both of them understood to mean that he needed to know whether what they thought they knew about the floor was still true in -18-degree cold. Martha came through the door and stood on the warm floor and looked at Eleanor standing at the table with hot coffee, and understood that what she had told 5 people before Christmas was still true, and was, if anything, more true than it had been then. The floor was warm. The room was warm. Eleanor was in her regular house dress without a shawl. "It works," Martha said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Martha took off her coat. She sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt the warmth of the floor coming up through the soles of her boots, and looked at the cold fireplace that had never been used this winter, and the capstone set into the bedrock floor, and the widow woman who had spent a summer chiseling channels in rock with a hand tool. "Calvin wants to know if it works in January," she said. "Tell him yes. He's going to want to come see it himself. He can come whenever he likes." Martha drank her coffee and let the warmth settle into her bones and said, "You should have told people sooner, in September, before it was cold." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "They wouldn't have believed it in September," she said. "They might have." Eleanor shook her head slightly. Not Calvin, she said, not Harlan Cross. People believe what they can feel. In September, they couldn't feel it. Martha thought about Calvin sitting up through the night, feeding the stove. She thought about what he had said on the ride home from the December visit, which was nothing, and what that nothing had meant, which was that he was thinking, and the thinking was not comfortable. He felt it, she said, in December. He sat on the floor, and he felt it. Eleanor smiled, which was a thing she did not do often. Yes, she said, but feeling something and believing it are different. He needed January. Calvin Heller arrived on January 13th. He arrived with Harlan Cross, which was either a coincidence or a plan, and Eleanor suspected it was a plan because Calvin Heller was a man who liked company when he was going somewhere to be wrong about something. He brought Harlan Cross so that if he turned out to be wrong, he would have someone beside him who was equally wrong, and if he turned out to be right, he would have a witness. They stood in Eleanor's cabin in their coats for approximately 2 minutes before Calvin took his coat off. This was not a casual gesture. This was a man who had been up 3 nights managing a stove that could not keep his own cabin above 50 degrees, standing in a room that had no visible heat source, feeling the warmth of a floor rising through his boots, and making a decision about what his body was telling him and whether his pride could accommodate agreeing with it. He took his coat off. Harlan Cross watched him do it and kept his coat on for another minute before he took his off too. Eleanor showed them what she had shown Martha, the channels, the capstones, the outside firebox. She showed them the firebox itself, the clay door, the draft control. She measured out 2 oak splits on the ground beside the firebox and said, "This is what I burned last night to heat the cabin. This, not a cord, not 3 armloads, 2 splits." Harlan Cross looked at the 2 splits and looked at the firebox and looked at Calvin. He had an expression on his face that was either thought or indigestion and turned out to be thought. "How much of it is the rock?" he asked. "The rock around the firebox, the walls of the channel." "All of it," Eleanor said. "The rock absorbs the heat from the fire and holds it. Air carries heat for a few minutes, rock carries it for hours. By the time I wake up in the morning, the fire has been out since midnight, and the floor is still warm, because the rock is still warm." Calvin Heller nodded. He was doing arithmetic in his head, the arithmetic of wood burned and cold endured, and money spent on cordwood every autumn. He was also doing a different kind of arithmetic, the kind that concerned itself with what he had said to whom, about the widow woman and her peculiar way of living, and whether any of it was going to need to be unsaid. He looked at Eleanor Marsh and said, "I owe you an apology." Eleanor looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said things about your situation that I wouldn't say now, about you not managing, about a woman alone not being able to handle a claim like this." He was not a man who apologized easily. Eleanor could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw. "You can help me now if you want," she said. "That would be worth more than an apology." He said, "What do you need?" She said, "I need people to understand the system well enough to build it themselves. I can explain it, but I need someone who can translate it into terms that Harlan and Bill Watts and the others will actually follow through on. Someone they'll listen to." Calvin looked at her. "You mean someone who isn't a woman?" She did not answer, because the answer was obvious, and saying it aloud would only make Calvin uncomfortable, and she needed Calvin useful. He said, "I can do that." He spent 4 hours at the Marsh claim that day. Eleanor walked him through every element of the system twice, answering questions with the patience of someone who had thought the same questions through herself over 2 years and had already worked out every answer. Calvin took notes on a piece of paper he folded into his coat pocket. Harlan Cross listened and asked his own questions, and by the end of the afternoon had developed the look of a man who was mentally redesigning something. They left in the early dark. the temperature dropping back toward its overnight low, and Eleanor stood at the door of her cabin and watched them ride south. The cabin behind her was 62 degrees. The floor was warm under her bare feet. She had 3 armloads of split oak in the outdoor woodshed, enough for 4 more days of heating at her current consumption rate. She was not lonely. She'd been lonely for a while after Joseph died, and had worked her way through it the way she had worked her way through everything, by occupying her hands and her mind with problems that needed solving. The floor had been, among other things, a cure for loneliness, because a person who is spending their summer cutting channels in bedrock does not have much attention left over for grief. She went inside and set her palm on the nearest capstone, and felt the warmth the rock was giving back, and thought about the French engineer's book and her father's mill, and the way water moved through channels with the same predictable physics as heat, the same preference for the path of least resistance, the same willingness to be directed if you understood its nature. She thought about Joseph saying the crack was imperfect, and herself spending 2 years learning that the imperfection was the best feature of the floor. She thought, the thing you build around can become the thing you build with. She did not write this down. She just thought it standing on the warm stone and let it sit. Calvin Heller was as good as his word. Better, actually, because Calvin was a man who was most useful when he had been wrong about something and was motivated to make the wrongness right. He spent January building the understanding of Eleanor Marsh's floor heating system across the Blackwater Creek settlement, with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything else that required moving information from one place to another. He did not present it as a woman's idea exactly. He did not lie about it either. He said, "The widow Marsh has built something on her claim worth seeing," and he said it in a way that meant what he said and also conveyed that he thought it was worth seeing. And on the frontier, Calvin Heller, thinking something was worth seeing, was sufficient recommendation for most of the men in the settlement to go look. They went. Bill Watts went first, because his new addition's walls were still leaking cold through the rags he'd stuffed in the gaps, and he was willing to consider any alternative. He spent 2 hours at the Marsh claim with his boots off, standing on the warm floor in his wool socks, asking Eleanor questions about the channel dimensions and the type of stone and what she had done when a channel didn't work the way she planned. She answered everything. Harlan Cross went back for a second visit, this time with measurements and paper, and spent the afternoon in the cabin and outside at the firebox, making sketches that Eleanor corrected when they were wrong and confirmed when they were right. Reverend Alderman came on a Sunday after service, which was the visit that surprised Eleanor most, because Reverend Alderman had been one of the voices, filtered back to her through Martha, who had expressed concern about a woman living alone in a stone cabin on a ridge claim, doing things that people couldn't quite describe, but which didn't quite seem right. He came, and he sat on the floor, and he felt the warmth, and he said, in the careful voice of a man revising a position, "The Lord gives wisdom in unusual forms. This is wisdom." Eleanor did not say anything in response to this. She poured him coffee and let the floor speak for itself. Martha Heller said afterward that Reverend Alderman's visit was the one that changed things most, because in a settlement where the minister's opinion carried weight on everything from crop rotation to fence line disputes, having the minister sit on Eleanor Marsh's floor and call it wisdom was the most effective possible endorsement of something that the community had been holding at arm's length for months. After the minister, the questions became practical rather than skeptical. How deep were the channels? What stone worked best? Could you use a natural formation if you found one, or did you have to cut the channels from scratch? Eleanor answered every question. She drew diagrams on paper. She walked people through the system at the Marsh claim until they had seen it enough times that they could describe it accurately to someone who hadn't seen it. She did not charge for any of this. Martha asked her once why not, because Martha was a practical woman who understood that knowledge had value and saw no reason Eleanor should give it away. Eleanor thought about it for a moment. Joseph wanted to build something that would last, she said. He built these walls to last 50 years, maybe more. I built the floor the same way. If the floor is just mine, it lasts one lifetime. If other people build it, it lasts as long as people are building. Martha considered this. Joseph would have liked that, she said. Eleanor said, Joseph would have thought it was obvious. He was a practical man. By February of 1858, 4 families in the Blackwater Creek settlement were in various stages of planning or beginning stone channel systems beneath their floors. None of them had Eleanor's advantage of existing bedrock close to the surface, which meant they were working with cut stone and clay mortar to construct artificial channels rather than following natural fissures. But the principle was the same, and Eleanor had demonstrated that it worked. Calvin Heller began excavating beneath his own kitchen in late February, breaking up the packed earth floor with a pickaxe to lay the channel foundations. He hired 2 neighbors to help with the heavy work, and Eleanor came twice to inspect the progress and point out where the channel dimensions were wrong and how to correct them. Calvin listened and corrected, and did not say anything about taking instruction from a woman because he had decided that the relevant category was not woman, but rather someone who knows more about this than I do. The spring demonstration was Martha's idea. She organized it in March, when the worst of the winter was over, but the evenings were still cold enough to make the system's performance obvious to anyone who came through the door. She told every family in the settlement that Eleanor Marsh was opening her cabin on the last Saturday of March for anyone who wanted to see the floor heating system in operation, ask questions, and understand how it worked. 22 people came. They came from as far as 8 miles away, families who had heard about the warm floor through the relay of frontier communication that moved information across distances through a chain of conversations at trading posts and church services and chance encounters on the road. They filled Eleanor's cabin until people were standing in the doorway. They walked on the warm floor in their boots and then took their boots off when Martha Heller told them to take their boots off so they could feel it properly. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and explained the system from the beginning, from the natural crack in the floor that Joseph had cursed, to the French engineer's book about Roman hypocausts, to the channel construction, to the firebox, to the capstones and the draft control. She spoke for an hour and answered questions for another hour after that. She was not a practiced speaker in front of crowds, but she was a former teacher, and she knew how to organize information and present it in sequence and stop when she had said everything necessary. At the end of the afternoon, Reverend Alderman stood in the doorway and looked at the crowd of neighbors and said, "We have been sitting all winter in cold houses burning wood we couldn't afford. And the answer was here, in this floor, the whole time." He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Thank you for your patience with us." Eleanor said, "Thank you for coming." She did not say, "I have been here for 3 winters and nobody came until January of the 3rd one." She did not say, "I put the stove in the barn in the summer and none of you noticed until October, and then what you noticed was the absence of smoke." She did not say, "The French engineer who understood this built his understanding on top of Roman engineers who understood it first, and the Romans understood it on top of whoever came before them, and the knowledge has been available for 2,000 years, and it takes nothing more than a book and a crack in a floor to rediscover it." She did not say any of this. She poured coffee and let 22 people walk on her warm floor and feel the thing that no amount of words had been able to convey as efficiently as the simple fact of the stone beneath their feet. That was the spring. What came later built on it. By the following autumn, 11 structures in and around the Blackwater Creek settlement had been modified to include some version of Eleanor's floor channel system. Some were full excavations, channel networks cut beneath packed earth floors on natural stone bases. Some were simpler, a single channel running beneath a kitchen floor, connected to an outside firebox, providing steady warmth in the most used room without the labor of heating the full structure. A few were hybrids, using the channel system for baseline warmth and a small stove for cooking and supplemental heat on the coldest days. The diversity of approaches told its own story. When people understood the principle, the specific form they chose reflected their materials, their construction skills, their priorities, and their site conditions. Eleanor's version had required an unusual gift, a natural fissure running through usable bedrock. Calvin Heller's required excavating beneath an existing floor and laying stone by hand. Bill Watts's new addition was built from the ground up with the channel system incorporated from the beginning, which was easier than retrofitting it into an existing structure. None of the approaches were identical to Eleanor's, and none of them needed to be. What they shared was the principle: heat mass rather than air. Use rock and stone to absorb combustion energy and release it slowly. Build a fire that warms a building the way a warm stone warms a hand, steadily and for hours, rather than intensely and briefly. The fuel savings were the number that changed minds most decisively among men like Calvin Heller and Harlan Cross, who thought in practical accounting terms. A household that had been burning 8 cords of wood per winter burned 4 or 5. At $3 a cord, that was $9 to $12 saved per winter, enough to buy a milk cow in 2 seasons or sufficient seed for an extra acre of corn. In a settlement where cash was scarce and every winter was a calculation of whether resources would last until spring, this was not an abstraction. This was survival arithmetic. The less quantifiable benefit was what Martha Heller described to Eleanor one afternoon in the second autumn, when she had lived for 1 full winter with the channel system under her kitchen and was thinking about the difference. "My children's boots stay dry," she said, "not because I hang them near a stove, because the floor is warm and things dry on it." She paused. "I don't wake up at night to feed the fire. I sleep through. Calvin sleeps through." Eleanor waited. "We were tired all winter," Martha said. "Every winter since we came here, because someone was always up managing the fire. You wake up, you feed the fire, you go back to sleep, you wake up again. You do this all night, every night for 4 months." She looked at the floor of Eleanor's cabin. "We didn't know we were tired. We thought that was just what winter was." Eleanor said, "What did you think when the winter was over and you weren't tired?" Martha smiled. "I thought someone had fixed winter," she said. "Then I understood it was just the floor." There was a conversation that Eleanor Marsh had with Calvin Heller in the 3rd autumn after the floor demonstration, a conversation that she thought about for many years afterward because of what it revealed about why people resist understanding things that are available to be understood. They were standing outside the Marsh cabin while Calvin inspected the firebox passage in the ridge, looking at the fit of the clay door and thinking about whether a cast iron door would hold the draft better. It was a practical conversation, the kind Calvin had become comfortable having with Eleanor since January of the cold year. He said, without particular preamble, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "You built this in the summer of your 2nd year," he said, "the summer of 1856. "Yes. "And you were warm that winter, warmer than any of us." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell us?" "In autumn, before the cold came." Eleanor looked at the firebox opening and thought about what to say. She said, "I tried once. In November of that year, I mentioned to Martha that the floor was warm without the stove. Martha mentioned it to you." Calvin was quiet. "I remember," he said. "I said something about it not being possible to be warm without a stove." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "You heard that I said that. Martha told me yes." He looked at the clay door. "And so you didn't try again?" "Until January." She said, "Would you have listened in November?" He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I wouldn't have. I would have needed to be cold enough first." Eleanor said nothing. "You let us be cold," he said, "not with cruelty, but you let it happen." She said, "I showed Martha in October. I opened my door every time someone came. I answered every question. I did not go door to door and insist." She paused. "I have learned that insistence doesn't work as well as evidence, and evidence requires patience." Calvin Heller looked at her for a moment. He said, "My grandfather had a phrase, 'The teacher teaches when the student arrives.'" "Yes," Eleanor said, "something like that. That was the winter of 1857 to 1858. The floor system that Eleanor Marsh built from a crack in her stone floor and a French engineer's book and 2 summers of precise work with hand tools spread through the Blackwater Creek settlement over the following years and became, in that community's particular history, the innovation that changed what winter cost them, not only in firewood, in exhaustion, in illness, in the particular grinding anxiety of watching woodpiles shrink and counting the weeks until spring. The system Eleanor had built was not new when she built it. The Romans had known the hypocaust for 1,000 years. Medieval European builders had used variations of the underfloor channel principle in monasteries and manor houses. The principle of heating mass rather than air is as old as the first person who sat beside a stone that had been warming in the sun all afternoon and understood that the stone was giving something back. What was new was the application. A stone floor in a frontier cabin in Missouri Territory, built by a widow woman with hand tools and a dead man's inheritance of good stone and a crack in the bedrock that everyone else called a floor. What was new was the specific person who looked at the specific imperfection and asked what it could become rather than how to fix it. The cabin stood on the ridge above Blackwater Creek for 63 years. It stood because Joseph Marsh had built it to last, and Eleanor Marsh had maintained it with the same intention. The floor channels were still functional in 1918 when Eleanor's granddaughter showed the system to a reporter from a St. Louis newspaper who was writing about unusual structures in the rural Missouri hills. The reporter asked Eleanor's granddaughter, who had grown up on the claim after Eleanor's death in 1901, whether the family knew how unusual the system was. She said, "My grandmother said it was obvious once you understood that stone was warmer than air. She said the hardest part wasn't building it. The hardest part was waiting for people to be ready to believe it." The reporter asked, "How did she manage that?" "The waiting." Eleanor's granddaughter thought about it. She said she had warm feet. She said that helped. In the Blackwater Creek settlement, in the winter of 1857 to 1858, when the temperature dropped to -18 and Calvin Heller sat up through the night feeding an iron stove that could not keep his eastern bedroom above 40 degrees. The stone cabin on the ridge was 64 degrees, no stove, 2 oak splits, the earth itself doing what it had always done. It was waiting for someone to ask it. If this story made you think differently about what ordinary people understood and what they were capable of building with what they had available to them, hit that like button now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And I want to know this. Have you ever found the solution to a problem inside the problem itself, the way Eleanor found her heating system inside the crack her husband called a floor? Because I think more people have done this than we give credit for, and I would genuinely like to read every answer, every comment, every one of them. Leave yours below. The floor is still there. The channels still run through the bedrock of that Missouri ridge, still connected to the cavity in the limestone, still opening to the hillside above through the passage Eleanor cleared with a chisel in the summer of 1856. No one has lit a fire in the outside firebox for 100 years, but the rock remembers the heat. Rock always does. That is the thing about stone that Eleanor Marsh understood better than anyone in the Blackwater Creek settlement. It does not forget what it has been given. The crack that Joseph cursed became the channel that Eleanor built. The flaw became the feature. The imperfect flaw became the warmest flaw in the territory, on the coldest night in the territory's young memory, in the cabin of a woman that everyone said would not last. She lasted 45 years on that claim. The flaw lasted longer.